presenting history's best on PBS.
Funding for the 50 Years' War, Israel and the Arabs, was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS viewers like you.
Victory in the war has not brought the hoped-for solution to all the problems in this part of the Middle East. Egypt, for example, declares that she will not reopen the Suez Canal until Israel gives up Arab territory she has conquered, which the Israelis are not prepared to do.
Israel's new Prime Minister, Mrs. Golda Meir, visited troops in the Sinai Desert, not far from the Suez Canal, where the shells continue to fly. He wanted a chance to inspect and talk to the men who are living face to face with the realities of the Middle East situation.
The death of President Gamal Abdel Nasser after 18 years in power devastated Egypt and the entire Arab world. His successor, Vice President Anwar Sadat, was considered little more than a figurehead.
Those in Nasser's inner circle thought they could steer policy on the course set by Nasser, and they were confident that Sadat would follow the party line.
The funeral was a grand occasion for the leaders of the Arab states and Nasser's Soviet allies. Nasser had severed relations with America, so the representative from Washington assumed he would be ignored.
Then a soldier came into the room, weaving his way through the crowd. Apparently, it turned out heading for me.
The soldier led Richardson away, out of the sight of the world's press and the watchful eye of the KGB.
I was trained to spot anything that was going on, but it was difficult in that chaos.
We went down the stairs. The lower floor was darkened, and propped up in the hospital bed was the man who had just inherited the presidency of Egypt.
President Sadat was resting away from the crowds after apparently suffering from heat stroke.
He said that he wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to turn a new page in the relationship between our countries.
The next day, Sadat put on a show for the American media. Egypt was a Soviet client state. Sadat considered Israel to be an American one.
The United States provide Israel from the loaf of bread to the phantom to the even deficit in the budget itself. So it is the vein of life. Vein of life for Israel goes from the United States.
Sadat didn't want to negotiate with Israel himself. He wanted the Americans to intervene, to deliver to Egypt the territories lost in 1967. In the 3 years since the war, Israel had established a formidable defense line along the Suez Canal, 70 miles from Cairo.
What are you doing?
I'm getting ready to blast you Israelis.
Why?
Because you Israelis occupy our land.
The Suez Canal had been closed since 1967. Sadat now told the Americans that if Israel moved back a few miles from the canal, he would reopen it, even to ships trading with Israel. Sadat's proposal followed statements made by Moshe Dayan, Israel's defense minister. Dayan said that the Sinai should eventually be returned to Egypt.
we say is that we sit there just because the war is going on. But once you agree to make peace agreement, we don't think that we should sit on your Suez Canal.
Golda Meir didn't want to negotiate through the Americans. She wanted direct talks with Sadat.
I'm prepared to go to Cairo, I'm prepared to go to Damascus, I'm prepared to go to Amman, I'm prepared to go to Beirut. Anywhere.
You would go to these places?
Yes. Happily. To negotiate peace, of course.
In Washington, President Nixon looked for the right person to urge Sadat's proposal on Golda Meir. He chose Joe Sisko.
I can recall the words to this day. He said, "Joe, press Golda. Press her hard, but don't cause a major Donnybrook between Israel and the United States."
Sisko met with the entire Israeli cabinet, but only Golda Meir negotiated.
Golda Meir took it upon herself to do all of the talking. It was interesting to see everyone here, all the ministers, nobody opening their mouth.
What they did to release their tension was sending little notes to each other.
I sent Diana Chit saying, "Listen, Moshe, I think we can get you some support." He sent back a very abrupt reply saying sarcastically, "Thank you very much. But if Golda is not for this, then I'm not for it either."
Sisko saw that something was happening, that nobody was supposed to speak there, and so he was a very smart negotiator. He asked the Prime Minister whether he is permitted to ask the Minister of Defense one question, a professional question. So what could she say?
I said to him, "Mr. Minister, if we don't do anything, what do you think is going to happen?"
Diane said, "Well, I cannot imagine that any government will tolerate indefinitely a situation where a strong army is poised at the gates of its capital." He was exaggerating. After all, our forces were at a distance of more than 100 kilometers from Cairo, and this will lead to war.
Golda Meir still insisted on direct talks.
The next day, I walked up with these flowers, rather gingerly, and she said to me, "Oh, Joe, now you're saying it with flowers. It won't do you any good."
In Cairo, Israel's rebuff almost brought about the downfall of the man who had proposed the initiative, Anwar Sadat. So he reversed course and tried a tactic more likely to win Arab support.
War is now inevitable. Whatever the price, whatever the sacrifice, we will not back down. We will not give up 1 centimeter of Arab land.
I thought of Sadat as a character out of Aida. I didn't take him seriously. He kept making grandiloquent pronouncements. He never acted on them. So I, frankly, thought he was bluffing.
Kissinger was too preoccupied with the Vietnam War to give the Middle East much attention. Even when Sadat made another offer.
He wanted Israel to return to the 67 borders, in return for which Egypt would be willing to make peace, which was a big step because no Arab state had as yet ever flatly said that they would make peace. We were in no position to handle that.
Sadat told me that Kissinger had said, "If all you have is a problem, I cannot deal with it. But if it becomes a crisis, then I can intervene."
Disappointed with American diplomacy, yet still unwilling to talk to Israel directly, Sadat set out to prepare for war.
في منزل الرئيس السادات في الجيزة وقال
The High Command met at Sadat's house in Giza. Sadat told us, "There is no hope of a peaceful solution, and I will not surrender to Israel. So our only option is war."
He said, "Get me back just 10 centimeters of the Sinai, and I will negotiate a miracle."
Sadat then proposed a secret alliance with President Assad of Syria. They agreed to plan a joint attack on Israel. Syria's top generals sailed to Alexandria to meet their Egyptian counterparts.
I went on a Russian ship, dressed in civilian clothes. I had a fake Egyptian passport and was using an alias, Jamal Hassan.
Once they arrived, they kept up the subterfuge.
In the evenings, we went to a nightclub, the Mumtaza. We were drinking and having fun. We wanted people to think we were just enjoying ourselves and that we did not have a care in the world.
At the hotel, the generals discussed the plans for their joint attack and decided on a special date.
The 6th of October was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. For the Jews, it is a holy day, a day of rest.
The Syrians hoped at least to recapture the Golan Heights, taken from them in 1967. To keep Israel's troops tied down, they needed Egyptian forces to advance across the Sinai. But the Egyptians had their own plan. They intended to limit their advance to territory protected by their anti-aircraft missiles in Egypt.
Our missiles could protect us for up to 12 kilometers. That would compensate for the inferiority of our Air Force.
Egypt's chief of staff urged Sadat to stick to their own plan.
He said, "Okay, we'll draw up a plan to show to the Syrians. This second plan had us advancing to the Sinai passes, but it was done just for the Syrians."
So it was agreed that the Egyptians would advance to the passes. They would pause to reorganize and then go forward again. Meanwhile, we would occupy the Golan Heights.
Whatever plans the Egyptians adopted, first they would have to cross the Suez Canal and do it under the gaze of Israeli troops.
The enemy are just 200 meters away. I can see them, they can see me. How can I catch them by surprise? I must hide my intentions.
We carried out many military exercises. The aim was to deceive Israeli intelligence. We wanted them to think we were expecting an attack from Israel.
Now, the presidents of Egypt and Syria also set out to deceive their fellow Arab, Jordan's King Hussein. They claimed Israel was about to attack them.
Sadat and Assad were worried about an attack on Syria that could have one of its hooks come through northern Jordan. In the final analysis, I assured them that as far as we were concerned, no one is going to use our country to attack anyone.
King Hussein smelled a rat. The last time Egypt and Syria had maneuvered him into a war with Israel, he had ended up losing a large slice of his kingdom. So he flew off alone, telling no one he was going to meet Golda Meir.
I was very concerned and worried that a state of no peace and no war was going to end us up in serious difficulty.
King Hussein talked about only one thing. He warned us to expect an attack from Syria and Egypt.
The Prime Minister received the king alone, but the head of Israeli military intelligence was listening, as Hussein warned of the Syrian-Egyptian preparations for war.
She was not convinced this information was reliable. You see, King Hussein himself was not 100% sure.
Instead of mobilizing the Israeli reserves, Golda Meir kept in place the usual 450 troops along the canal.
The attack was due on Saturday, October 6th. On the Friday, I went down and looked across the canal. On the other side, nothing was moving. I went back and told Sadat, "They can find out now. I don't care."
It was not till dawn the next day, as most Jews were preparing to go to synagogue for Yom Kippur, that Israeli intelligence finally became convinced that Egypt and Syria would attack within hours. The Israelis heard the call to arms on the radio and from rabbis in their synagogues. At 2 p.m., as civilians were reporting for duty, Egypt opened fire.
Our troops crossed the canal. They were shouting, "God is great, God is great," and they planted the Egyptian flag on the Sinai itself.
About 6 o'clock, I told my people, my forces, felicitations. The Israelis has lost their balance.
Sadat's armies drove the Israelis from the Suez Canal. Israel's Air Force tried to retaliate, but failed to break through Egypt's missile cover. The Egyptians advanced 8 miles into the Sinai and then stopped, as planned. In the north, Syria's attack also caught Israel off balance. 600 Syrian tanks rolled over Israel's defenses and across the Golan Heights.
We weren't ready today. We came from the home, in the middle of Yom Kippur.
So who was here? That was regular soldiers?
Yes, only the regular.
So they must have had a hard time?
Oh yeah, very hard.
Did you have many casualties?
Well, with such things we don't know. He's not allowed to talk about them.
The Syrians were expected to press their advantage.
We must keep on fighting with all our courage, faith, and trust, as a nation that knows we're fighting for our lives. And we are fighting for our lives.
Israel's defeat appeared imminent, but on the 4th day, the Syrians ran into a large Israeli force. Israel had been able to divert troops to the Syrian front because the Egyptian army had halted. Syria's President Assad demanded to know why the Egyptians were not advancing through the Sinai as agreed.
The president kept phoning Sadat and insisting, "This is not what we agreed."
Syria appealed over Sadat's head to the Soviet Union, still Egypt's patron. The Soviet Prime Minister came to Cairo to sort things out.
Prime Minister Kosygin kept asking Sadat why his forces had stopped without taking the Sinai. He was infuriated by Sadat's answers.
President Sadat yielded to Soviet pressure and gave the order to advance, much to the dismay of his chief of staff.
It was doomed to failure from the start. Israel's air force was much stronger than ours.
Now the war began to swing Israel's way. In 3 hours, 250 Egyptian tanks were destroyed. But Egypt still had 2 armies in the Sinai. The Israelis planned a daring coup. They set out to cut through the gap in the Egyptian lines, create a bridgehead over the canal, and sweep around to isolate the Egyptian Third Army. The architect of the plan was General Ariel Sharon.
We slipped through the Egyptian lines without major problems. But when we reached the canal, there was a ferocious battle. Eventually, at 1 in the morning, the paratroopers crossed to the other side in dinghies.
The next day, Israeli forces raced across the canal to secure their bridgehead.
I was at the canal. I could see the tanks crossing and the trees on the other side. It was a great feeling.
Israel's troops were now only hours from Cairo. President Sadat begged the Soviets to arrange a ceasefire.
The Israelis crossed the canal, and about 24 hours later, we got a message from Brezhnev inviting me to come to Moscow.
We thought Kissinger's visit to Moscow would be useful. He could help us stop the conflict.
We thought it would give the Israelis more time if I went to Moscow, because nothing could happen until I got there. While I was in the air, Nixon sent a message directly to Brezhnev saying that I was fully authorized to conclude, but I frankly wanted to stall.
The Soviets were in such a hurry to end the fighting that General Secretary Brezhnev led the talks with Kissinger himself.
He insisted that the advance be stopped. In return, Kissinger wanted the Arabs to recognize Israel's right to exist.
What we said was that there should be direct negotiations at some point between the Arabs and Israel. I told Brezhnev I would carefully communicate everything he said to Washington, but that there had to be some time interval so that I could get the president's views. And he said, no, here's a message. And he gave me power of attorney, that, in effect, power of attorney that the president had given me, which did not thrill me.
The Secretary of State realized he could stall no longer. While still in Moscow, he agreed to terms for a ceasefire. But it was another 5 days before the war ended. During that time, the Israelis encircled the Egyptian Third Army. A day later, The opposing generals met in the desert to work out how to disentangle their forces. It was the first formal meeting of Egyptian and Israeli officers in 25 years.
He offered me coffee. I said, no, thank you. He asked, can I get you anything else? I said, no. He said, it's cold. Can I get you a coat? I said, no, thank you. That was the end of the first meeting.
It was a week before the Egyptian general began to relax.
We went out and sat on the sand. We put a map down in front of us, and we put stones on it. We started to talk about how to disengage our forces.
I said, look, we have to end the friction between our forces. The answer is, you go back to the west side of the canal, and we will pull back to the east side.
I went and told Sadat we had reached an agreement. He was pleased with what we had achieved.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
Each side's dead were returned, and Israel allowed supplies through to the trapped Egyptians. But Sadat wanted more than a ceasefire and a disengagement. He wanted the Sinai back. But once again, he would talk only to the Americans.
He came out in military uniforms and said, I need a Kissinger plan. I agreed to do a shuttle and settle it fast, and he said he would make major concessions to make it possible.
Kissinger decided the way forward was to bring all the parties to a peace conference in Geneva.
I never thought you would kiss a woman. It's kissing her. After all, it's kissing her. I wonder who's kissing her now.
The Egyptians and Israelis agreed to attend the conference. And then there was President Assad of Syria.
I had heard he was impossible, but he greeted me with extraordinary politeness and courtesy. And I said, you know, it's amazing. They all accuse you of being so difficult.
Whenever Kissinger wanted to change the date or venue, President Assad agreed. Kissinger told him, you are so accommodating.
I got overconfident, and I said, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't? He said, yes, you didn't ask me whether I'm going to the conference. I said, are you? He said, no.
Assad did not want to negotiate with Israel. But Kissinger was able to get the rival armies to disengage. Sadat then attempted to strengthen his hand by embracing Syrian and Palestinian objectives.
Israel must move on all the fronts, on the Egyptian front, the Syrian front, the Jordanian front, the Palestinian.
At a time when Arafat wanted to replace Israel with a Palestinian state, Sadat pledged unity.
You see, we are cooperating together. And as we have mentioned, there are three partners: Egyptians, Syrians, and the Palestinians.
2 restless years passed. Then, Israeli elections brought forth a leader determined to hold on to the West Bank and Gaza.
What occupied territories? If you mean Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip, they are liberated territories. They are part, an integral part of the land of Israel.
The new prime minister made the building of settlements his first priority. Settlements like the new town of Yamit, where 5,000 Jews lived in the Sinai. Begin was highly suspicious of Sadat.
Sadat is an implacable enemy of Israel. This is also the truth. He is no fool, but he is an enemy.
Sadat's response would write his name indelibly into the history books. He announced he would make a keynote speech to the Egyptian parliament. He invited the leader of the PLO to attend.
Arafat was happy to be in the parliament, and he was happy that Sadat is paying attention to the Palestinian problem.
Sadat put his text aside, but he carried on speaking. I told the foreign minister he is about to throw a political grenade.
After 7 years of trying everything else but talking to Israel, Sadat broke the ultimate Arab taboo.
I am willing to go anywhere. Israel will be surprised to hear that I am ready to go to them, even to the Knesset itself, and negotiate with them.
The idea that Sadat would negotiate directly with Israel was so unthinkable, the audience applauded without realizing what he had said.
Everyone was applauding Sadat. Even Yasser Arafat was clapping. I know, because he was sitting next to me.
In Tel Aviv, no one was sure if Sadat really meant it.
Sadat then said if Begin invited him, he would come next week.
The next day, Prime Minister Begin was hosting a lunch at the Hilton Hotel.
The head of CBS in Israel wanted Begin's reaction. Begin was eating at the head table. I went up and gave him the message. He said, sure, I'll invite Sadat from here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hereby invite President Sadat on behalf of the government of Israel to come to Jerusalem and to start negotiations to establish permanent peace between Israel and Egypt.
Before accepting the invitation, Sadat flew to Syria to persuade President Assad that the trip to Jerusalem would not be a betrayal of the Arab cause.
We asked the president to arrest Sadat to stop him going anywhere.
But Assad considered Sadat his guest and preferred to hear him out.
President Assad was trying to make Sadat change his mind.
He told me, it will be proved that you are wrong. I said, very well, Assad. This is a sacred mission for me. And if this is going to be the last mission as a president, I shall be very happy to fulfill it.
President Assad was not impressed. They talked for 7 hours.
Assad's ministers urged him to act. The Presidential Guard was standing by.
President Assad refused. He said, it is against the Arab tradition for a man to arrest his guest.
President Sadat returned safely to Egypt. 3 days later, he set off for Jerusalem.
I feared for his safety. We had been enemies for 40 years. He was putting himself at their mercy. He would be sleeping there that night. I was very anxious. Sadat's plane was late. I overheard a senior security officer talking. He was saying, hold on, maybe instead of Sadat there is a suicide squad on the plane, and they will jump out and kill the assembled Israeli leaders.
When we arrived in Tel Aviv, it was like I was coming to outer space. It means it was something completely new. I find myself in a car, sitting near Moshe Dayan, and we have to find how to begin a conversation. And I have read in the book that he was interested in archaeology. So I mentioned that I was interested in archaeology, and we begin to talk archaeology.
The Israeli people greeted Sadat's arrival from Egypt as though he were Moses, come again.
I come to you today with a firm desire to make peace.
Sadat offered peace, but he was careful not to abandon the other Arab states or the Palestinians.
There are Arab lands still under Israeli occupation. We insist on complete withdrawal from these territories, including Arab Jerusalem. It was quite a speech, quite disturbing. I passed a note to Begin saying we must be on our guard.
Ezra Weizmann, the defense minister, who was a great advocate for peace, said when he heard the speech that maybe we should mobilize the reserves.
The visitors went from the Knesset to a dinner in their honor.
It was a kind of dinner where there was not much talk. The atmosphere was cool.
President Sadat and Mr. Begin were not speaking to each other. They were sitting with their backs to each other. I decided to invite Ezra Weizmann and another minister up to my suite after dinner.
Mustafa Khalil told me, we have to do something. Otherwise, the whole trip will be without any follow-up. What about having a meeting together? I say, no objection.
So now I found myself sitting with our worst enemy at the King David Hotel, drinking Black Label.
I want to enter directly in the process and mentioning what are the problems of Cairo today and the problems of Egypt, and this is why we need peace.
I said, let me show you something. I took him to the window. I said, take a good look. Do you really think you can divide this city?
I say the solution is this direct talk with the leadership of Israel, and through this direct talk, direct contact, everything will be solved.
It wasn't that simple. After the trip to Jerusalem, the two sides continued to talk for 7 months. But Begin would not give an inch. Sadat confided in the new president of the United States.
Sadat felt that the peace process, instead of having been moved forward, had actually been almost terminated by a fruitless gesture to go to Jerusalem. So he was quite discouraged.
I asked President Carter, the Senate, the Congress, to take their share as full partners in the dispute that's between us and Israel. I'm waiting for this moment.
I found myself isolated from all my advisors. All of them thought that it was a bad idea.
President Carter then set out to resolve 30 years of conflict in a week of talks at the presidential retreat at Camp David.
We arrived by helicopters, and we find this kind of small bungalows in the forest. People quite relaxed. People were using bicycles, and it was quite strange for us.
Some of the Americans even brought their children. The National Security Advisor challenged Israel's prime minister to a game of chess and got a preview of his negotiating technique.
I was about to make my first move when he dramatically seized my hand in midair and looked me straight in the eye and said, and he's always very serious and formal, "Dr. Brzezinski, do you know when I played my last chess game?" And quite frankly, I was a little dismayed because I couldn't care less. And he says to me, "September 1940, when the NKVD broke into my hiding place in Vilna to arrest me." So I said to myself, oh my God. And in the midst of the game, Mrs. Begin appears. She looks at us and says, "Oh, the two of you are playing chess. You know, Mr. Brzezinski, Menachem just loves to play. He just loves to play. He plays all the time."
When President Carter brought the two leaders together, Sadat listed the demands: the return of the Sinai to Egypt and a Palestinian state in the West Bank with its capital in Jerusalem.
Sadat and I both knew that this was not going to be at all acceptable to me or the Israelis.
We all hit the roof, not just Begin. They were taking a hard line. We all said, this simply won't work.
They wanted to storm out, to terminate the talks. And I jumped up from the desk where I was sitting and writing and got in the door in front of them. And I wouldn't let them get out of the room until they both agreed to let me try to continue. And after that, the two men never saw each other for the next 10 days.
The incompatibilities between the two sides were so intense that some sort of an American document bridging the gap and extracting from each side those relatively few elements on the part of each side that were of a compromise nature seemed to us to be the only way to proceed.
So I carried the same text back and forth. Begin and Sadat agreed to go with the same text, with brackets and modifications and marginal notes.
Carter focused their attention on a clause that would require Israel to give up Gaza and the West Bank to the Palestinians.
Begin simply dug in his heels and says this is totally unacceptable.
As far as he was concerned, this was Greater Israel, or it's Israel, and they hadn't acquired territory by force. It had always been ordained as part of Israel.
Begin remained intransigent, so Carter persuaded Sadat to give up his demand for a Palestinian state, to the outrage of his advisors.
It was a real shock for us. Our main preoccupation was to avoid a bilateral agreement between Israel and Egypt at the expense of the Palestinians.
But that wasn't enough for the Israelis.
They say, no, 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 no. They are refusing to withdraw from the Sinai, that they want to maintain the 3 airports, that they want to maintain the settlements.
The Israelis delegated Moshe Dayan to convince Sadat that he would have to compromise on the Sinai, too.
Dayan told him, Mr. President, if anybody has told you that Israel can leave the Sinai settlements, they are deluding you. President Sadat was so upset that he asked me for airplanes. He said, I'm leaving. If I cannot even get Sinai back, then what is the use of my continuing this peace process?
I asked Sadat if he would go back in his cabin and talk to me. All of his bags were on the front porch. I told Sadat he had betrayed our friendship. He had violated a commitment that he made to me, that he would give me full opportunity to resolve any differences that arose, and that I thought that his peremptory action in leaving without giving me another chance would also seriously and adversely affect the relationships between our two countries.
Sadat unpacked his bags. Carter would now have to get the Israeli Prime Minister to yield.
I was about to play tennis. I was dressed in whites. Begin was always dressed as if he was about to go to a funeral. And we went for a walk in the Camp David woods. And he says to me very dramatically, I want you to understand, that my right eye will fall out. My right hand will fall off before I ever sign a single scrap of paper permitting the dismantling of a single Jewish settlement.
Prime Minister Begin had taken a solemn oath before God and the Israeli people that he would not dismantle Israeli settlements. So I had to devise an alternative to that so that he would not do it.
Carter urged Begin's advisors to find a way around their prime minister's solemn oath.
The only way was to let the Knesset make the decision and not him.
Dayan and Weitzman started speaking up to Begin in Hebrew rather than in English as they did in the past.
I said we cannot go back empty-handed. We must find a compromise.
Begin's colleagues concluded that the only way to persuade him that dismantling the settlements would not damage him politically was to get the settlers' champion on the phone.
Prime Minister Begin, God rest his soul, told me there are problems over the Jewish settlements in the Sinai. He wanted to know where I stood. I answered in one sentence, I will support any decision you take.
Prime Minister Begin's phone call opened the way for a White House ceremony. The Knesset voted to dismantle the Sinai settlements. Egypt became the first Arab state to recognize Israel's right to exist. Israel gave back the Sinai.
Let's have a handshake before we
Sadat and Begin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
I'm so proud of both of them.
While we have the ceremony and the different speeches and the different signature, we were listening to the Palestinians, which were outside, and was just shouting to remind us that the Palestinian problem have not been solved.
The peace with Israel that Sadat concluded has lasted to this day. But many Arabs were enraged. 2 years later, at a military display in Cairo, Islamic extremists assassinated Anwar Sadat.
This program is a production of WGBH, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for the 50 Years' War, Israel and the Arabs, was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and PBS viewers like you.
This is History's Best on PBS.